Good morning, children. Today we will have a new lesson. The title of the lesson is Mother's Day. Actually, this is fifth chapter from your supplementary text snapshots. Okay, and it is written by J.B. Priestley. J.B. Priestley was born at Manningham, which he described as an extremely respectable suburb of Bradford, United Kingdom. His father was a headmaster. His mother died when he was just 2 years old. Priestley was educated at Bellevue Grammar School, which he left at 16 to work as a junior clerk at Helm and Company, a wool firm in the Swan Arcade. During his years at Helm and Company, he started writing at night and had articles published in local and London newspapers. So today we will learn a lesson from this great author, that is Mother's Day, and let me show you his image. Yeah, here is the image of J.B. Priestley. You can just read. Okay, this is the image, and John Boynton Priestley, that is full form of J.B. Priestley, was an English novelist, playwright, screenwriter, broadcaster, and social commentator. His Yorkshire background is reflected in much of his fictions, notably in The Good Companions, which first brought him to wide public notice. Actually, courtesy to Wikipedia for this information. Born 13 September 1894, Manningham, Bradford, United Kingdom. Died 14 August 1984, Stratford upon Avon, United Kingdom. Spouse Jacketta Hawkes, 1953 to 1984. Another Jane Wyndham Lewis, 1926 to 1953. And some of the movies: An Inspector's Call, Last Holiday, The Old Dark House, The Good Companions, and more. Okay, so at least you should know something about the writer. Now we will go in detail with the story. It is very interesting story, Mother's Day. Actually, this is a very humorous play written by J.B. Priestley, and the background is in 1950, when the position of the mother and the housewife in a family was, subordinate. She is not respected by the other members of the family. Okay, and generally a housewife, now in the modern world we call as a homemaker. She has to perform all the work, but at the same time people say she is a housewife, no work. But at the same time, a housewife has to perform many pieces of work in a household or in a house. Okay, and generally they will not get any recognition or any words of gratitude. That's the problem. That's why J.B. Priestley has highlighted this issue. Actually, according to him, a mother in the family should be respected, and we should give her all such respect and gratitude, right? So let us see how he has portrayed the character Mrs. Pearson. Okay, let us now go through the main characters. Yes, children, here is the text for you. Mother's Day, J.B. Priestley. The following is a humorous portrayal of the status of the mother in a family. Let us read on to see how Mrs. Pearson's family reacts when she tries to stand up for her own rights. Actually, the central character is Mrs. Pearson, the mother in the family, and she is trying to stand up for her own right. Actually, she is not respected, I told you already. So it was a general trend in UK, United Kingdom, those days. That's why that is the role of a writer. Okay, whenever some injustice is there in the society, a writer comes up with that idea, and he will disseminate this among the common public. Okay, now let us see how this character is portrayed by J.B. Priestley in the text. So now let us go through the main characters. Mrs. Annie Pearson, that is the full name of her. George Pearson, children, you can note down her husband George Pearson. Doris Pearson, her daughter. Okay, you can easily remember D for daughter. Okay, this D for daughter. Doris Pearson and Cyril Pearson. When you come to know who is daughter, the other one is son. Okay, Cyril Pearson, that way you remember. And Mrs. Fitzgerald. Who is Mrs. Fitzgerald? Neighbor of Mrs. Pearson. Okay, so what I want to tell you is it is all about a humorous story, and there are five main characters, and Mrs. Pearson actually is not respected in the family because that is a custom that practiced in that during that time, and whereas the neighbor Mrs. Fitzgerald wanted to teach Mrs. Pearson about that respect. Okay, how the family members should behave. Actually, Mrs. Pearson, what happens? Her husband and children all will bully her, means will trouble her by giving her work. All the piece of work should be performed by the mother, and children just enjoying, husband also just enjoying. So who came to know about this? Her neighbor Mrs. Fitzgerald came to know about it. So she is ready, Mrs. Fitzgerald is ready to help Mrs. Pearson, and how that help is rendered. That is what the story is about. Okay, now let us go through the text in detail. I am not going to tell the entire story right now. Clear? So now we will go through the story slowly, step by step, because line by line explanation is required. It may take a few classes. Okay, don't worry about it. The action takes place in the living room of the Pearson's house in a London suburb. What is suburb? The outskirt of a city is called suburb. Outskirt of a city is called suburb. Time, the present. Okay, now itself, now also present, not in the past. Scene, the living room of the Pearson's family. Afternoon, time is afternoon. It is comfortably furnished, much lived in room, living room in a small suburban semi-detached villa. Villa, duplex, house, flat, all these things, a small villa, separate house. If necessary, only one door need be used. Suppose you are going to enact this drama, only you can make use of one main door, but it is better with two. One or two can be there. One up left leading to the front door and the stairs, and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. There can be a muslin covered window. Muslin is a kind of cloth. Okay, a thin cloth is called muslin covered window in the left wall, and possibly one in the right wall too. The fireplace is assumed to be in the fourth wall. Okay, there are four walls in a room, Okay, so what is there in the fourth wall? There, a fireplace. Okay, it is a cool region, and people will generally have a fireplace in their houses. And there is a settee, sofa settee, you say, sofa settee up right, an armchair down left, and one down right. A small table with two chairs on either side of it stands at the center. So you can very much see this setup. There is a picture, you can see, just go through that. Okay, that settee is there, the table is there. Okay, two characters. Who are these? One is the main character, Mrs. Pearson. The other one is Miss Fitzgerald. You can see from the face, one who is very confident is Mrs. Fitzgerald, one who is holding the cup, and the other one a little meek, a little having fear on her face, that is Mrs. Pearson. Okay, now we will learn about these two characters. Okay, now, so what is the background, that how the scene should be. That is a living room, that a table is there, two chairs are there, all these details are there. Okay, now Mrs. Fitzgerald collecting up the cards. They are playing cards, and that is all I can tell you. Mrs. Pearson could be a good fortune, could be a bad one, all depends on yourself. Now make up your mind, and there it is. I told you already, this neighbor is there to help her, so she is giving her some idea how she should behave when her husband comes, how she should behave when her daughter comes, how she should behave when her son comes. So some idea is already passed on to her. So that discussion is going on. Okay, Mrs. Pearson, yes, thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. I am much obliged. I am sure it is wonderful having a real fortune teller living next door. Did you learn that out is too? What is obliged here? Thankful. Actually, Mrs. Pearson is very thankful to Mrs. Fitzgerald for her help, and whatever she is going to help her. And not only that, Mrs. Fitzgerald, that neighbor, has learned something about fortune telling. She can tell about the future. And for that, Mrs. Pearson asked how she happened to learn that art. Okay, Mrs. Fitzgerald, I did 12 years I had of it. So how many years she studied about that? 12 years, with my old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster, her husband. Okay, he learned a lot and I learned a lot more. Both husband and wife learned about that art of telling the future. But will you make up your mind now, Mrs. Pearson dear? Put your foot down once and for all and be the mistress of your own house and the boss of your own family. This is what Mrs. Fitzgerald wanted to teach her. What is that? The how she should behave. She should behave in very bold way. Okay, put your, what is that? Yeah, put your mind, hood down. That means you have to suppress. What's the meaning of this? Put your feet on me. You have to suppress your family members. Okay, you should be a bold lady. You should have the courage to talk to them, to control them. Especially actually she's not like that. But who is teaching her to do like that? Mrs. Fitzgerald is asking her to do like that. Put your foot down once only. Then the fear can be created in the mind of the husband, mind of the daughter, and mind of the son. That is what she is teaching now. Okay, clear, children? Now Mrs. Pearson, smiling apologetically, regretfully. What is apologetically? Regretfully, smiling. That is easier said than done. Besides, I am so fond of them, even if they are so thoughtless and selfish. They don't mean to be. Actually, this mother has no guts to talk rough with family members. So she is very meek, humble, polite. So she speaks in such a musical tone. Okay. I am so fond of them. Actually, she loves them very much. Actually, she has pampered the children by loving too much. That is called pampering. Pampered them too much, and she even pampered her husband. So she cannot behave so easily in a rough way. Okay, that's what is there. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, cutting in means interfering. Okay, interpreting. You can write down interpreting or interrupting. Maybe not, but it would be better for them if they learn to treat you properly. But again, the neighbor is telling her, no, you have to treat them roughly. Okay, Mrs. Pearson, yes, I suppose it would in a way. Mrs. Fitzgerald, no doubt about it all. Who is the better for being spoilt, grown man, lad or girl? Now neighbor is asking, who is actually the spoilt one? Means who has the problem actually? Whether the husband, that means grown up man, lad, okay, the boy or the girl? Nobody. You think it does them good when you run after them all the time, take their orders as if you were the servant in the house, stay at home every night while they go out enjoying themselves. Never in all your life. It is the ruin of them as well as you. Husbands, sons, daughters should be taking notice of wives and mothers, not giving them orders and treating them like dirt. And don't tell me you don't know what I mean, for I know more than you have told me. Why? Because Mrs. Fitzgerald is her neighbor. She knows it well that Mrs. Pearson is not respected in the family. Actually, what they do, the husband giving order, daughter giving order, son giving order, all are giving orders to the mother, or the wife. Husband, wife, for children, mother. So who is obeying all these orders? Mrs. Pearson. So who knows about it? Mrs. Fitzgerald knows. So now Mrs. Fitzgerald wanted to help her. Mrs. Pearson dubiously, means doubtfully, keep dropping a hint, at least one hint. Mrs. Fitzgerald, hint? Hey, don't give any hint. You behave. It is more than hints your family needs, Mrs. Pearson. Simply telling they will not obey you. I mean, they will not get themselves corrected. So hint will not work out. Who said? Neighbor said. Mrs. Pearson dubiously, again doubtfully, I suppose it is, but I do hate any unpleasantness, and it is so hard to know where to start. I keep making up my mind to have it out with them, but somehow I don't know how to begin. She glances at her watch or at the clock. Oh, good gracious! Look at the time. Nothing ready, and they will be home any minute, and probably all in a hurry to go out again. So, by the by, Mrs. Pearson happened to look at the clock, and she was little worried. Why? She could not arrange food. She could not arrange anything. So she is now much tensed and worried. Okay, this is actually her problem. Now you see what will be the reply from Mrs. Fitzgerald. Okay, as she is about to rise, Mrs. Fitzgerald reaches out across the table and pulls her down. Hey, don't go, sit here, like that. Mrs. Fitzgerald, let them wait or look after themselves for once. Don't do any work for them for once. This is where your foot goes down. This is your weakness. Start now. She lights a cigarette from the one she has just finished. Actually, Mrs. Fitzgerald is a chain smoker. She will continue smoking. Okay. She's a very rough lady, very really bold lady. Mrs. Pearson, embarrassed. What is embarrassed? Very much confused. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I know you mean well. In fact, I agree with you, but I just can't. And it is no use you trying to make me. If I promise you, I would really have it out with them. I know I wouldn't be able to keep my promise. And finally, she expressed her, inside out. She said, no, I cannot behave in a rough way. I am going to drop this idea. So who will not be ready for that? Mrs. Fitzgerald. Then let me do it. Then finally Mrs. Fitzgerald said, now I will do it for you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, how is it possible? Oh no, thank you very much, Mrs. Fitzgerald. But that wouldn't do at all. It couldn't possibly be somebody else. They would resent, dislike it at once and wouldn't listen, and really I couldn't blame them. I know I ought to do it, but you see how it is. She looks apologetically across the table, smiling rather miserably. Actually, Mrs. Pearson is now worried how her neighbor Mrs. Fitzgerald can control the family. So that's why she is worried now, and she is looking at her apologetically, okay, regretfully, right? Mrs. Fitzgerald, coolly, you haven't got the idea. Hey, I am not going to control your family. That's what she is going to tell. How? Then Mrs. Pearson, again bewildered, confused. Oh, I am sorry. I thought you asked me to let you do it. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I did, but not as me, but as you. Dear children, here we will stop for the day. Actually, the idea is Mrs. Fitzgerald will exchange the personality. I mean, Mrs. Fitzgerald will go to Mrs. Pearson, and then Mrs. Pearson will become very bold, and Mrs. Pearson's personality will come to Mrs. Fitzgerald, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald will become very meek. So this is what is the plan, and tomorrow we will know more about it, and let us wind up for the day. And before we conclude, let us make an immediate review of what we have learned today. So dear children, today we started a new lesson, that is Mother's Day, written by J.B. Priestley. It is all about a humorous play, written by J.B. Priestley to show the disrespect from the side of the family members towards a housewife. And he wanted to highlight this issue through this play. Okay, so the main character is Mrs. Pearson and her neighbor Mrs. Fitzgerald, a very bold lady. Okay, and her voice also very rough and tough, whereas Mrs. Pearson's voice is very meek, humble. Okay, and she is exploited by her family members. So here comes Mrs. Fitzgerald with the idea of exchanging the personalities. I mean, Mrs. Fitzgerald has got the knowledge of black magic, and she can do that. So it's a story. Don't ask any question regarding this. Okay, it is in the story. It is there. Mrs. Fitzgerald will exchange the personality. Then what will happen? Mrs. Fitzgerald will become Mrs. Pearson, and Mrs. Pearson will become Mrs. Fitzgerald. Okay, that's all, and that we will learn from tomorrow. Dear children, have a nice day ahead. Thank you very much.